Fresh thoughts.
I have 1 million. I stopped, but I was like, stop, I use that. But one thing. No, it's a lovely pen. I can't do trust with a pen like that.
I can't help getting that close.
I can't help getting that close. So sorry, I never knew it was
Do you know anything? You're holding the camera. I didn't.
Good morning. Welcome to Sarah Fojtik's oration. Before I introduce Sarah's oration, I just want to say a few remarks about working with Sarah. Our integrated curriculum makes many demands on new students. You have to go out into nature and suffer for 21 days in the wilderness. You have to memorize poetry if you like math, to do math if you like poetry. You have to do philosophy if maybe you're inclined to be more literary. And one of the virtues of Sarah's thesis is that she has managed to integrate different modes, not all of which she felt entirely at home in, but labored diligently and productively over. And eventually was able to arrive at the literary mode that she finds most comfortable. So I'm very pleased with the work of integration that Sarah has done in this thesis, bringing together philosophy and theology and literature. I think an example of the kind of integration that we encourage students to achieve here at Roman Catholic. So with that, I will introduce Sarah. Her oration is entitled Naked and Unashamed, Vulnerability as a Movement Towards Edenic Relationship.
Thank you, Dr. Schubert, for being my advisor and walking me through every step of this process. And thank you, Dr. Thompson, for being my supervisor, and Professor Cooper for being my third panelist. Let's start with a prayer. In the name of God and Son, the Holy Spirit. Amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
I want to begin with the first quote on your handout from C.S. Lewis. Love it all is to be vulnerable. Love and your heart will be wrung and possibly broken. If you want to make sure of keeping it intact, you must give it to no one. Vulnerability is unsettling. It carries with it this sense of fear, discomfort, and rightly so. If you look at the word itself, it comes from the Latin term vulnus, meaning wound. To be vulnerable, then, means to inherently render oneself woundable. It demands living in such a way that one's heart, which is the image we use for the seat of emotion, the most personal aspect of one's being, is left open to attack or damage, naked and exposed to the world, if you will. This assurance of protection and stability, maybe even a certain element of prudence. After all, if we stay hidden and insulated from the world, isn't the possibility of harm mitigated? But the more one examines vulnerability and its effects, the more we come to find that it is this indispensable component of man's well-being. It's critical for the formation of authentic relationships. It's the art of connection, the tie between individuals, without which man's very nature remains incomplete and unfulfilled. So, in this oration, I want to first walk through a few of the different ways that we actually use the term vulnerability and see what that can teach us about it. I want to look at the state of pre-fallen man in the book of Genesis. I want to take a look at shame, which most often is what discourages us from being vulnerable. And then finally, I want to address a few different misconceptions that we often have. So vulnerability. As a term, it's very multifaceted and equivocal. We use it to describe this wide array of people and situations. We use it when we're talking about somebody who's just had their heart broken, a child's inability to care for itself, even somebody daring to present a new idea. So in order to understand these uses and why they all fall under the jurisdiction of the same term, I found it helpful to draw out two different categories. We have the forms of vulnerability that man has essentially no control over. And then we have a form of vulnerability that man can deliberately exercise some level of control over. Under this first category, I've placed two different forms of vulnerability, physical and emotional. Physical is probably the most clear-cut. It implies nothing more than man's inability to defend himself from harm against exterior circumstances. We're always subject to the natural dangers of the world, exposed to the possibility of harsh weather or famine, physical harm, a pandemic. So even while we can try to find shelter and security, the potential for harm can never really be entirely abolished. Humanity stands as this King Lear, quote, contending with the fretful elements, always faced with the fearful truth that unaccommodated man is no more but such a poor, bare, forked animal, unquote. The second form in this category, emotional vulnerability, is maybe a little less immediately evident than physical vulnerability, but certainly no less prevalent. It's the threat of woundedness that man undergoes as this intellectual, feeling creature who can suffer loss and disappointment. We can't eradicate the experience of emotion. Even while it can be trained by reason and properly directed towards virtue, we're always subject to the ravages of feeling. And this vulnerability isn't just confined to what we typically regard as of emotion. like heartbreak or anger or despair. Often we find that even being in a state of desire or joy is a vulnerable experience. And this is because anything that's been gained always bears with it the possibility of being lost. This is the reality that C.S. Lewis was trying to convey when he said to love at all is to be vulnerable. Those who attempt to reject this reality, trying to deny or reject the validity of their emotions, quickly find, as Chip Dodd puts it, quote, feelings are required material to be able to live the human experience rather than a mechanistic objectification of our existence. Vulnerability to emotion is critical to be able to do the human thing. For as C.S. Lewis so positively notes, we are born helpless, and as soon as we are fully conscious, we discover loneliness. So man, then, is this inherently vulnerable creature. But the final form of vulnerability, which is the one that I want to be the main topic of this oration, falls into the second category, as the only kind that man can deliberately have some control over: vulnerable sharing. Author Brené Brown, who's a well-known researcher of vulnerability and shame, offers us a concise definition. It is, quote, showing up and being seen when we have no control of the outcome, unquote. But this definition points to yet another unsettling truth. While we can dictate whether or not we share our vulnerability with another, choosing whom to share with, and how to frame our narrative, once we've done so, the situation escapes the realm of our control. Once the choice has been made to share ourselves with another, we have to leave them to engage with or disregard it. So thus, while the physical and emotional forms of vulnerability always take place on this purely interior basis, vulnerable sharing is necessarily rooted in relation. It's bound to the uncertainty that always accompanies human relationships, where we're always going to have that possibility of hurt or rejection. So then we're left to question, if man finds uncertainty this deeply uncomfortable place to be, and already suffers from the vulnerabilities that are inherent to our nature, why then should we engage in vulnerable sharing? What's the value in deliberately placing ourselves in a position to be wounded further? The book of Genesis actually starts to answer some of these questions for us. The first chapters offer us an insight into this deep need written into the human heart: communion with one who shares our nature. After Adam's creation, God revealed a really critical truth. It is not good that the man should be alone. Even though he's surrounded by the animals and blessed with this perfect communion with his creator, Adam experienced a certain lack. Paradise itself could not be fully enjoyed in the absence of a like-natured companion. In looking at this verse, authors Katrina Tenike and Michelle Boras, in their book Called to Love, John Paul II's Theology of Human Love, state, quote, Adam could not fully understand himself or his fundamental relation to God without Eve, unquote. So thus we see that the human need for companionship, or for relationship, goes beyond simple companionship. It's requisite for understanding our own selves and for entering into relationship with God. For it was in relationship that Adam and Eve discovered their, and this is the third quote, their capacity for, Yes, for it was in relationship that Adam and Eve discovered their, quote, capacity of expressing love. That love in which the person becomes a gift, and by means of this gift, fulfills the meaning of his being and existence, unquote. So what then was it that actually allowed for this relationship to exist? Adam and Eve's gift of self was manifested by a very particular condition. They lived naked and unashamed. But this nakedness extended far beyond mere physicality. In examining this verse, Edenic and Boras note that the human body, being as far more than a mere physical object, quote, expresses the person, unquote. It, quote, allows us to encounter and communicate with the world, other people, and God. In other words, it makes communion, the gift of self given and received, possible for us. The bodily dimension of human existence makes visible the fact that we were made for love, unquote. So thus, Adam and Eve's nakedness expressed an interior disposition, their willingness for pure vulnerability and exposure with the other. They were deeply immersed in this knowledge of themselves as a creature that God willed for his own sake, as John Paul II puts it, and therefore one who is worthy of entering into a relationship with another. Nakedness was not something to be feared. Adam and Eve's exposure, both on the physical and the relational levels, was this direct link to the unity that they enjoyed. But, as we all know, with the introduction of sin came a fundamental shift in this communion. When Eve encountered the serpent, his arguments revolved around a single point. God was not to be trusted. She succumbed to the lie that God had chosen to withhold a certain gift from them, the knowledge of good and evil. The choice to act on this belief immediately subverted Adam and Eve's relationship with God. They lost the grace of sharing in his life. And this first loss was inevitably accompanied by another. Adam and Eve's recognition of themselves as a gift was grounded in the knowledge that they were created and cared for by one who was entirely good. When they lost the proper perception of their creator, the one whose image and likeness they bore, they lost the ability to have a proper perception of themselves. They lost the ability to view, quote, the other person completely and naturally within God's vision, without the slightest inclination to manipulate or use, unquote. Lust and greed had entered into the story of mankind. And this is the story that we're left with today. So now, equipped with the knowledge that they were naked, a realization that they were never really meant to have, Adam and Eve lost their desire for exposure. Nakedness was no longer this simple, pure expression of their willingness for vulnerability and relationship, but an opportunity to be used and abused. It was now possible to be seen in one's broken entirety, and consequently unloved. Man was left to wrestle perpetually with this tension between desiring and fearing to be known, and the introduction of clothing marked our first rejection of vulnerability. But within this history lies an answer to our original question: why ought man to be vulnerable? Vulnerability was the means by which Adam and Eve were able to engage in relationship, and thus come to a full understanding of their own being and purpose. And so we're left with a powerful truth. To be vulnerable is to take a step back towards man's original condition in paradise, and the full realization of our humanity as God intended it. But in order to understand what it means to return to this Eden-like vulnerability, we need to take a look at what it meant for Adam and Eve to cease being unashamed. For it is shame that poses the most formidable obstacle to vulnerable sharing. Brené Brown devotes a lot of her writings to defining and examining what it entails. And she first points to the fact, quote, the terms embarrassment, guilt, humiliation, and shame are often used interchangeably. In reality, however, shame bears a really stark distinction. In trying to delineate between these terms, Brown notes, and this is quote 5, the best place to start untangling emotions is with shame and guilt. The majority of shame researchers and clinicians agree that the difference between shame and guilt is best understood as the difference between I am bad and I did something bad, unquote. So thus, while the first three of these terms, embarrassment, humiliation, and guilt, are fixated on what has been wrongfully or imperfectly done, shame affects the perception of one's very person. It makes a statement about who one is rather than what one has done. And so Brown offers us a definition. Quote, shame is the feeling or experience of believing that one is flawed and therefore unworthy of love and belonging, unquote. Shame leads us to believe that we aren't actually capable or worthy of entering into a relationship, and that no one would genuinely want to pursue it with us. Under its influence, we gradually come to believe that relationships are an impossible pursuit. Much like the term vulnerability, however, the term shame bears with it a number of other connotations. The most prominent of these is the ancient understanding of the word. We see it appear throughout the Greek and Roman histories as this driving force behind man's pursuit of honor. There was nothing more abhorrent to the heroes of the time than the shame of cowardice. The Iliad offers us a number of vivid examples. Odysseus sends his troops to battle with the words, "The brave live glorious, or lamented die." The wretch who trembles in the field of fame meets death, and worse than death, eternal shame. With the opportunity to flee before him, Hector says, "I would be terribly ashamed before the men of Troy and the Trojan women trailing their long robes if I would skulk away from battle like a coward." Shame and the fear of shame was a radical influence in shaping the heroes of the time. But this use of shame differs widely from Brown's understanding of the word. Her understanding is not motivated by a desire to be honored or remembered well by posterity. It's not the public recognition of a lack of excellence or a failure to achieve some standard set up by society. Those understandings actually accord more closely with humiliation, as Brown understands it. It centers around accomplishments and failures, and the subsequent regard or disapprobation that society ascribes to them. But shame as it relates to vulnerability is directed more at that consideration of one's own self. It leaves us paralyzed to progress and virtue rather than driven. It leaves us paralyzed to progress and relationship rather than driven towards honor and virtue. And such is the form of shame that we find in the Genesis account. Adam and Eve's desire to hide was motivated by more than this simple distress or guilt at their disobedience. If we take a look at Adam's statement, "I heard the sound of thee in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked," we see that it's directed not at considering what he has done, but at who he has become. He doesn't claim that he hid because he was afraid that he had sinned, but because he was naked. Adam and Eve's interior assurance that they were worthy of communion had been shattered. Nakedness was now a weakness to be renounced. Their response was directed not just at concealing what had been done, but at shielding their very selves from God and from each other. And this is the particular form of shame that relates to vulnerability. And this first experience has been mirrored in humanity throughout the ages. It's really deeply and uncomfortably familiar. For, as Brown notes, shame is universal. But even though everyone experiences it, shame is also marked by this drive towards isolation. It carries with it the conviction that our experiences are inaccessible or inexplicable to others, thus, quote, deriving its power from being unspeakable, unquote. But there's a really deep irony in this, because shame is also rooted in our fear of disconnection. Even though it's not good for man to be alone, shame facilitates this distorted belief that if we stay hidden and distant from the world, then our brokenness is going to stay hidden as well. But this attempt to maintain our worthiness in the eyes of others actually unintentionally sabotages the very connection that it's trying to preserve. If we choose to distance ourselves from others continually, we're eventually going to be left with no relationships to be rejected from. Now, the fear of shame can never be entirely abolished. We're always going to be susceptible to this fear that we're unworthy of love or belonging. And so Brown says, as long as we care about connection, the fear of disconnection will always be a powerful force in our lives, and the pain caused by shame will always be real. But even though we're always going to experience it to some degree, it doesn't mean shame is this experience to just be submitted to and accepted. Because we're also always going to retain that desire to be seen and known. If we're going to move forward from the damaging effects of shame, we have to first recognize its presence in our lives and overcome that compulsion to internalize it. We have to engage in vulnerability and put ourselves on display for others. Now, I want to turn to a few different misconceptions that we often have about vulnerability. In spite of everything that I've just said, we almost always have this tendency to equate it with weakness or cowardice. There's this drive to prevent the revelation of our brokenness to another, or even just from seeming too emotional. And so Brown notes, quote, our rejection of vulnerability often stems from our associating it with dark emotions like fear, shame, grief, sadness, and disappointment. Emotions that we don't want to discuss. Unquote. The fear of rejection is really powerful. It requires this act of courage to be able to overcome that. And thus we see that vulnerability is anything but weakness. It demands this ability to confront the reality of our emotions and willingly admit another person into the depths of our interior life. It demands that we put ourselves on display in pursuit of a higher good, those relationships that actually let us fulfill our being and purpose. Now, another point of misconception is this idea that vulnerability could just be offered to anybody in its entirety. It's certainly possible to offer too much of ourselves to the wrong person. Brown emphasizes that vulnerability is based on mutuality and requires boundaries and trust. It's not oversharing, it's not purging, it's not indiscriminate disclosure. Vulnerability is about sharing our feelings and experiences with people who have earned the right to hear them. So while having a certain level of relationship and trust is critical to actually be able to share our vulnerability is also going to help build up that same trust and relationship over time. And so this is quote 12. Sharing appropriately with boundaries means sharing with people with whom we've developed relationships that can bear the weight of our story. The result of this mutually respectful vulnerability is increased connection, trust, and engagement. In fact, attempts to engage in vulnerability without some level of trust can actually be a way to avoid stepping into the realm of authenticity. We get this illusion that we've actually shared ourselves with somebody and let ourselves be seen without being authentic. And so the third point that I want to make is the belief that the recipient of vulnerability can just stay passive. Empathy is indispensable. It requires that we acknowledge the separateness of another while still trying to connect with something inside of ourselves that knows that feeling. It's that which actually allows us to see the person who's trying to be seen. Even though we use the terms sympathy and empathy interchangeably, there's a real difference between them. Sympathy acknowledges the difficulty of somebody else's situation without actually striving to accompany the other through it. Empathy entails a certain moving into the experience of another person, and sympathy holds them at a distance. The practice of empathy allows us to offer this reassurance that others aren't alone in their experience of their emotions, whatever those may be, and that their experience isn't inaccessible to other people. It's exclusively through the practice of empathy that vulnerability can be properly received. So, to conclude, I want to return to that quote from C.S. Lewis that I started with. To love at all is to be vulnerable. Love anything, and your heart will be wrung and possibly broken. If you want to make sure of keeping it intact, you must give it to no one. Here, C.S. Lewis offers us a perfectly valid solution to our fear of vulnerability. We can choose to retreat, isolating ourselves from others, because that which isn't exposed to the world certainly can't be hurt, right? We're going to be safe from all attachment, emotion, connection. But Lewis doesn't end here. He continues. Wrap your heart carefully round with hobbies and little luxuries. Avoid all entanglements. Lock it up safe in the casket or coffin of your selfishness. But in that casket, safe, dark, motionless, airless, it will change. It will not be broken. It will become unbreakable, impenetrable, irredeemable. To love is to be vulnerable. Unquote. The heart withers without vulnerability. It's that which allows us to love, to come close once again to that perfection of Edenic relationship. But the tragic truth is that we're never going to stand on this earth again perfectly naked and unashamed. We're only going to catch brief little glimpses of it. Because vulnerability isn't an act that can only be engaged in once. It's not this easily definable experience, marked by clear desire and execution, that ends the moment it's been shared. We have to continually reconcile that desire to be seen with that fear of being seen. But by doing so, we find that vulnerability is what actually allows us to engage in authentic relationships. And it is only by doing so that we can satisfy that need that God has written into our hearts and into our very beings. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. So we'll begin with questions from our panelists.
I was wondering about whether you could talk a little bit about closedness. It seems to me that though this might be a result of the fall, um, we have emotional clothes, mental clothes. There's a social reality clothes. What is the role? Is there a positive role of clothing?
Yeah. To be clear, I'm not advocating that we get rid of clothing.
Colony
So the kind of emotional clothing that you're talking about actually kind of refers to those boundaries that Brown was talking about too. There are, the reality just is that there are people who are going to emotionally manipulate and abuse. And we do need to have a certain degree of protection from that. But when we're in relationships where that possibility is at least drastically mitigated, where we don't really have to fear about that, then I think that's where that clothing comes into kind of a problematic light. Yeah. You kind of have to know when to undress, in a sense.
So clothing has a self-protective role because you don't want to give where gifts should not be given. And you mentioned that in your misconceptions there, but does it also have a role in self-gift? Does it have in terms of protecting us from the possible negative consequences of giving where the gift is not proper, but actually somehow in terms of the way in which does it have a role also in self?
In helping us to give ourselves to other people. Honestly, I can't think of an example where that would be the case. I think it offers this boundary that keeps us from being seen. And if we're going to give ourselves as a gift, you can't give a gift and keep it wrapped. It's got to be unwrapped so that you can actually see it and accept it. So I don't think that there's a case where clothing really facilitates that self-gift.
What about just to take a very kind of prosaic example, like when on a date a girl gets dressed up to look nice for her husband or her partner?
More about like embellishment.
Is she hiding? She's hiding her true self from him in doing that. Maybe she's sorry.
I see what you're saying. And that makes sense. Yeah, for kind of presenting things as beautifully as they can be. And the thing is, we don't have to. Vulnerability isn't just about sharing only what's broken. It's about sharing our entire selves, and a lot of that is beautiful. If we're giving a gift of self, we have to give what's beautiful as well as what's broken. And so I think it's okay to, say that gift involves this kind of offering the beautiful with the broken, like that example of dressing up.
To go to the biblical analogy, right? So the biblical story begins with after the fall of nakedness and unashamed, and then there was a creation of the leaves to hide one's being. But even into the New Testament, the idea of finding our true selves in being clothed. Can you talk a little bit about the New Testament idea of being clothed in Christ and how that might connect this whole question of nakedness and clothing and true giving of oneself and when and whether it's possible?
Yeah, I think that being clothed in Christ is really a reference to how our identities are being changed. It's like taking on the baptismal robe, like that indelibly puts a mark on our soul. I don't think it's from others or from God. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. You could say that the culture, current culture, is a shameless culture. It makes many people naked and unashamed. For all the wrong reasons. Is it a shameless culture? Is it a culture of openness and vulnerability? I mean, based on your schema, where are we?
Yeah, so I think when we're talking about a shameless culture, we're not talking about what Brown really understands as shame, which is that, what's the definition? The feeling of or experience of believing that one is flawed and therefore unworthy of love and belonging. That just refers more to this kind of distorted conscience, this inability to recognize guilt, and not being afraid to let others, or just not being afraid to have no sense of morality. It's not the same type of shame, I don't think.
Well, are people actually vulnerable within our culture, or is it or we got fig leaves all over the place?
I think we see, you see all these posts on social media about influencers sharing all these personal little details of their lives. And that isn't really what I think is real vulnerability, because it's not directed towards a relationship with a person. They're just kind of throwing it out into the world. Sometimes that can be kind of an emotionally manipulative thing, or an attempt to seem like somebody that you can relate to. But I don't think that's vulnerability in its purest form. It's a bit of a distortion of it.
So are people in our culture vulnerable, or where are we? Or as C.S. Lewis summed it up rather well. I don't know.
So, okay, vulnerable sharing, or like the vulnerability to, I posed a few different kinds of vulnerability. Are you talking about, are people sharing vulnerably, or are they just vulnerable in the sense of physical or emotional vulnerability? Because I think C.S. Lewis is referring to the emotional vulnerability in this quote.
Yeah.
Which is just the basic reality of kind of human existence, just because we experience emotions, and that lets us get attached to things, lets us get hurt, it lets us, lose the things that we love and be hurt from that. So just
are we vulnerable in that way, or
in the emotional vulnerability? Yeah. I think so. I don't think that's something that can be avoided. It's just man's state as a vulnerable creature.
Yeah, that's a perfect segue into my question, Sarah, because as we've been talking for this year about vulnerability, it seems to be becoming more and more clear that vulnerability is a sort of something, an inherent feature of what it is to be human. Man is rational, but also man is vulnerable. Yeah, it's indelibly marked in who we are, and so much of the way that we think, the way that we act is an attempt to mask that vulnerability, protect ourselves from that vulnerability. So where do we speak kind of the really big implications of man as a vulnerable being? Would you be comfortable, right, with making that kind of really broad, like anthropological claim on par with, right, man is rational and is vulnerable, right? What would that mean?
Yeah, so my first thought is to tie it back to theology and relationship with God, actually. Just because the fact that we are these vulnerable creatures kind of puts us in our place in the cosmos. We're able to recognize that we're not gods. We don't have complete control over everything. And in fact, we're subject to a lot. As I said, the weather, basically, and just emotion. We're just constantly being hurt and re-hurt over and over again. Is that kind of along the lines of what you were thinking, or?
Yeah, it's really unsettling vision of ourselves.
Yeah. It's a humbling vision of ourselves.
Yeah, maybe that's the difference between being humbled by my vulnerability versus being utterly driven by my fear of vulnerability, such that I'm constantly trying to stave off the vulnerability. And there I don't mean just vulnerable sharing. I have the totality of my vulnerability, right? I'm always trying to protect myself from that, and I mean, to the extent of course, wearing clothing. But I think you could see a theological belief as a kind of attempt to protect myself from the vulnerability of death or something, or a philosophical system, right, as being something to protect me, from the recognition of my own vulnerability, or this political status or social status as a way of protecting myself from my own vulnerability. So yeah, that sounds really scary, but then you just said, yeah, we should be humbled by it and have to see our relationship with God.
Yeah. I mean, part of it is just accepting the reality of human life and our place in the world, but not letting ourselves be bogged down by that. Also realizing that we have this, as Christians, we have this identity as a child of God. It's that paradox of the human condition, where on one hand we're fallen and broken and just sometimes these really horrible creatures, but then on the other hand we're made in the image and likeness of God. So it's holding those two kind of in a balance, and being able to reconcile them with each other.
Can I? Seems like the ends of vulnerability, as you described it, are this kind of total self-gift where you're inside of someone's mind and feelings that is proper really only in very rare human relationships and perhaps one's relationship with God. I'm interested if you can talk about the kind of self-gift and the kind of vulnerability that's proper to the public figure, someone who gives their life to their people in some sense, or like maybe a Hector or a statesman, or I don't know. It seems like there is some kind of analogy, but also some kind of very big difference.
Yeah, and I think that's because you're having one person, this figurehead, who's kind of being vulnerable. Well, are you thinking about them sharing their vulnerability with somebody, or them seeing other people's vulnerability?
I think both might be interesting to go into, but my mind immediately goes to, in what sense is someone who, like a Churchill, who gives his life in the public sphere, in what sense, what kind of is that some kind of vulnerability, and how is it different, and how is it related to the kind of intimacy that you're really talking about?
Yeah, so I think that is kind of a form of vulnerability. Your life very much is on display for an enormous number of people. But the difference between that and these intimate relationships that I'm talking about is the fact that it's not really reciprocal. You can't have a mass number of people be vulnerable back to him. The vulnerability that I really wanted to focus on was that kind of the one-on-one mutual relationship where you're able to be vulnerable with somebody and have them be vulnerable back. So I think there's a certain value to a figurehead being vulnerable like that, where you have people that are able to relate to and love that person, but it's not the same type of vulnerability.
So if Churchill got to the dispatch box in Parliament and he sort of started talking about his inner feelings or something, suddenly all of England would become way too vulnerable very quickly to enemies or something like that. But I don't know what I'm trying to say here, just that it seems that if that Churchill actually, I don't know, that someone in that position can't give themselves in a kind of, it gives themselves in part by not opening up their internal psychological life. In fact, when there's a certain kind of vulnerability in saying, my internal psychological life is completely irrelevant to who I am when I stand before the walls of my people, or something like that.
Which would be those boundaries. That kind of relationship between a statesman and his people is very different from the relationship of two equals. And you could equate it to the relationship between a parent and a child almost, where the child's just entirely vulnerable. They don't have that kind of fear of vulnerability that we do most of the time. But if the parent were to share every little aspect of their emotional life and all that, the child does not have the emotional bandwidth to deal with that. That would be a very improper use of vulnerability. So I think it's kind of like
So
that.
there is then a kind of self-gift that is predicated on not being sharing your vulnerability in parent could not give himself to his child if he exposed all his emotional anxieties.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. It really just depends on the level of relationship, the kind of relationship, and using a great amount of prudence in determining whether or not you should be vulnerable and whether or not that's appropriate for the relationship.
Aren't those statesmen perhaps making themselves vulnerable in the first category of vulnerability? If they're sort of exposing their, I can be humiliated in front of people publicly, right? I become emotionally vulnerable, not because I'm emotionally sharing with someone and someone might reject it, right? It's because, I'm a human being, but it's being heightened because I'm out there on the stage, so to speak, or becoming like Hector, physically vulnerable, that I offer my body up to Achilles.
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
Is it more? Is the first type of vulnerability more what's happening in the public sphere?
I think so, because you're not having that deep personal connection between the whole of society and one person.
When you are managing to paint a target on yourself, right?
Yeah, you're exposing yourself to the possibility of a lot of hurt and a lot of embarrassment just because it's on a greater scale.
Okay, well, questions from the audience.
Thank you, Sarah. That was a lovely operation. I was wondering if you could talk a bit about the difference between authenticity and vulnerability.
Do you think they're mutually exclusive? Is that where?
I guess it seems that vulnerability, at least in I think that your second sense, was like kind of a personal like relationship. You're trying to build with someone. Whereas authenticity, maybe it seems doesn't really have to be so personal.
Yeah.
And maybe like with Dr. Cooper's example of a statesman, maybe rather than being vulnerable would just be authentic. Is people?
I see what you're asking now. Being authentic, not kind of putting on that mask of a different personality almost in front of people. I think maybe that's kind of what it is. The whole acting like you have a different personality, a different life. Whereas vulnerability and vulnerable sharing is actually kind of audibly talking about your emotions and experiences with another. They're very, very closely related. But authenticity is something that really should just kind of perpetually be held, whereas vulnerability is not something that needs to be constantly done. It's for kind of particular instances.
As you address a room full of most women, how can we help the men in our lives understand the need and just how to be vulnerable?
Don't even.
It really is isn't even our role, first of all, to teach men how to be vulnerable
And to help them enter into relationships
that
are
just
close and
form deeper connections.
I think that's definitely a benefit of relationship that women can bring. Just because we kind of have that heightened sensitivity to our emotions. And as for a practical way to actually help men do that, you kind of just gotta practice it yourself. You can't force somebody to be vulnerable. You just have to continually practice it yourself in those situations that are right for it, and hopefully they'll see the benefits of it over time.
Can you talk about Sonia in this context? So,
Oh, Sonia. How does she help? Yeah. So Sonia Raskolnikov, the reason why he's this is something I talked about a lot in my thesis. The reason why Raskolnikov is actually able to be vulnerable with Sonia is kind of related to this fact that they're both these figures that have kind of stepped over the conventional line of morality. They're kind of on the same page. And so that's really, really helpful when you're trying to be vulnerable. You can actually relate. Yeah, no, the murder and the prostitute. Yeah, Sonia is just, she doesn't force it out of him. She kind of just gives him the space and doesn't really offer him any judgment. She's horrified when, she's really horrified when she hears about what he's done. But she doesn't reject him because of it.
Thank you, Sarah. That was lovely. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more, and this is related to the questions that have been being asked in the political sphere. But I want to talk about like the role of vulnerability in love theologically, because in C.S. Lewis' statement, to love is to be vulnerable. It doesn't seem like he's speaking about a specific kind of love, but authentic love. And it seems like when Christ is exhorting us to imitate him in love, that is the most authentic. So what is the place of vulnerability in this universal love of neighbor and total gift of self in imitation of him? Because Brown would disagree and say that it's exclusive to those who earned it. But Christ says, you don't just love those who love you back, you love your enemy.
Yeah, so the vulnerability that Brown's referring to there is the vulnerable sharing. You have to share, those emotions, experiences, kind of actually talking out with somebody who's earned the right to hear it.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas I think in the Christian life, we're looking more at that kind of physical vulnerability. We're asked to go out and help the poorest of the poor and, kind of take care of their own vulnerability. And that doesn't mean that we have to go out and vulnerably share with them necessarily. They're just two very distinct things. Caring for somebody in a physical sense to help take care of that vulnerability versus vulnerability in relationships where you're just kind of sharing.
So can I follow up on that? Would you call it distinct kinds of vulnerability or simply like maybe a spectrum of vulnerability?
I think distinct kinds. Because one is very much talking and sharing the depths of your interior life, whereas the other is kind of a physical situation, and just the possibility of being hurt in that. Dr. Popopoulos?
Could you say a little bit more about how you know when to be vulnerable? You addressed at certain points the ways in which the attempt to have a kind of mutual vulnerability can be abused by one party, and then all kinds of emotional manipulation and so on into the picture. How I'm also thinking of Tocqueville's description of the very sensible young American woman who is not sort of carried away, not Sonia, just not French, right? It's women, American women are very different from those kinds of girls. And so how would you advise American or just people generally to know and how to be vulnerable with another? How do you judge the person in front of you?
Yeah, this is a question where the main answer to it is mostly prudence. And this is where kind of having a certain level of relationship and trust with somebody already built up kind of comes in. You can't just share with anybody. You're going to be hurt if you do that. But the reality is also that we can't ever completely have enough trust in somebody that we're not going to get hurt, or just completely know that we aren't going to get hurt if we share with somebody, no matter how much we trust them. Because honestly, it wouldn't be vulnerability anymore if we did that, if we had an absolute assurance that we weren't going to be hurt. But you have to be very, very careful in who you choose to be vulnerable with. And some of that is just the process of time. You just have to get to know somebody to a certain extent before you can learn that they're trustworthy enough. Yeah, it's prudence.
Maybe a sorry, just to follow up for a moment, a related question to this that might clarify things is, could you say more about the strength that is involved in vulnerability? I take it that you're saying vulnerability is not just like being weak or embracing weakness.
Yeah.
But I also take it that vulnerability, the ability to be vulnerable in front of another is not simply that. It's not simply, okay, I'm gonna share my wounds with you, or my ability to be wounded with you, and like that itself is the sign of the strength? Is there more?
Sharing your ability to be.
Is there more strength required by a person, sort of separate from just the willingness to open yourself to disrobe, as it were? Are there other strengths that the person should be cultivating so that they can kind of open themselves up to a fruitful, vulnerable? Does that question make sense?
I think so. Let me see if this answers it. I think that some things that can really help you be vulnerable in a healthy way is having an emotional, healthy emotional life. There we go. And being able to kind of regulate and be very aware of your own emotions. And be able to kind of identify what you're feeling within yourself. That ability to kind of read other people and the strength to be able to do that. Yeah, I think there's definitely it's all very integrated. We need to be able to share what's going on inside ourselves. We have to actually know what that is. So I think there are some other strengths that do need to be cultivated. That kind of.
Can you say, Sarah, is that really like one way of exercising the Socratic maxim to know thyself?
Yeah,
that kind of strength there.
I think that can apply. Yeah. Yep. It's a lot easier to share what's going on inside you when you know what that is, instead of some unidentified feeling. Dumb.
I wish you could explain more as an analyst. When is it appropriate, or is it appropriate to tell someone not to be vulnerable to you?
Yeah, I think there are definitely some cases where people are going to force their vulnerability onto you, and a lot of that is probably because they're coming from a place of not being able to do that in really deep, authentic relationships, and so they kind of just do it wherever they can, because it's still a need that we have. So I think the decision to tell them whether or not that they should be vulnerable with you at that point is another prudential decision. You have to look at their state. If they're doing it because they don't have anybody else to share with, it can really be an act of charity and love to accept that vulnerability, even if you know it's not going to be really moving towards relationship. Are you talking about it more with like somebody we already know?
I have one more question.
Okay. Grown button.
Okay, I had a question specifically. You spoke about Genesis, so the Old Testament. I was wondering if you could maybe speak briefly on Jesus and the cross, because there was a really good point. I think it was Dr. Papadopoulos. We're bringing up the fact that part of what will happen inevitably if we're vulnerable is that you recognize that there's a chance you're going to get hurt, but also with that you will, like C.S. Lewis said, that you will get hurt.
Yeah.
And I guess my question is, like Jesus on the cross, naked, with the absolute most pain that God asked anyone to go through. What's your response? What do you think your response should be? Is once you like take the risk and you fall? Like
How do you react to being hurt?
How do you react? And like how do you build yourself up to the point where you're courageous enough to do it again if you think you need to?
Yeah. Yep. I think, well, hopefully you're going to have enough experiences of vulnerability actually being beneficial and building up a relationship that you're going to see that it's not just being hurt all the time. It goes back to the courage. If you recognize that it's something that's actually really deeply needed for relationships, then you know that you're just going to have to keep pushing through, even if you want. Yeah, that's a really hard one. How do you keep going after you keep getting hurt?
Is there like, do you think there's some sort of, is it just like a virtue of fortitude, like just keep trying? Or is it like, is there in your reading of Genesis, and maybe in the reading of the Bible, did you find something like kind of the resurrection moment where just, is there a way you can see the cross or the pain that you go through afterwards as not just like a necessary step, but maybe something that you can learn to love? That makes sense? Like to love the cross.
That's getting into kind of a whole, how does suffering kind of play a role in the human life? Like, what's the benefit of suffering? How does it teach us, well, if you went to Braden's, how does it teach us hope? So that's a little bit beyond, but.
So, again, I'm Sonia. Do you think that the way that Raskolnikov sees the suffering that she takes on for others around her, that becomes
A motivation for him to be vulnerable?
Yeah, to be vulnerable to her.
So he kind of sees that as the chances of me being hurt from this are lessened?
Yeah, because I've seen her be vulnerable in this way with others and take that risk there. There's kind of an image of his taking out of the cross. And it works. Yeah, he sees it.
Yep, yeah. So again, the protecting yourself as much as possible by learning who to be vulnerable to. But then accepting when you do get hurt that there's always going to be other people that you can turn to who aren't going to abuse that vulnerability. You should, if you're going to keep pursuing relationships, you're going to find them eventually if you keep pushing through the process of being vulnerable. Yeah, I think the fortitude is the biggest part of it.
Great. Thank you, Sarah.
How'd you get it to work? It just zoomed in on its own, and it just decided to zoom out on its own. I don't know.
Subject to the